Hello, everyone in Science and Values. This lecture video is going to be dealing with the first part of the Michael Sandel reading titled The Case Against Perfection. Let me say just a little bit about kind of where we've been in the course and where we are now and why I'm having to read this. Um, in some ways, we started with kind of the question, what is science? And there was kind of an assumption there that science was something that was worthwhile. It was something worth knowing about. The entire question asking what is science assumes that science is an important human endeavor in an attempt to kind of know the world and describe the world. And so we started with kind of assuming that science was a good thing. When we then turned over the last 2 weeks to sort of more along the question of why science, more of a criticism of science. Not that we should somehow stop doing science or do something else instead of science, but that we want science to justify its authority. And so we looked at some of the issues as it relates to science as it interacts with society, especially in a democracy. In some ways, this next reading is a continuation of, it's not as critical of science as an institution, but it does presuppose in some ways that science needs philosophy to ask questions about itself that it itself is not willing to ask. That there is a limit to what science can do. There's a limit to how science can police itself, and that it needs philosophy, specifically ethics, to ask hard questions about the practices of science. And that's kind of the premise upon which Michael Sandel is writing this. And so, kind of where we've been and where we are now is we kind of did what is science, why science, and now what are the limits of science to police itself and to ask itself moral questions. And the argument of Michael Sandel is in some ways we need philosophy and specifically ethics to investigate whether or not some of whether or not this specific area of science, obviously genetics, but more specifically genetic enhancement, whether um, science can go too far when it comes to interfering with human life, with some of the natural processes of human life. And of course, this is there's questions about this all the time. Questions about artificial intelligence and um, machine learning and robots, things related to that. The questions about technology, about whether technology can go too far, and whether we should desire for technology to get to such a point that we no longer even recognize the machines, or the machines become smarter than human beings, or the intelligences that we create become smarter than us and we can't even control them. So questions about the limits of science uh, and how far science should go when it comes to interfering with human life. And um, that's the same premise that Sandel is starting from. He wants to pause and ask whether or not we think that something like genetic enhancement is a desirable application of science. Um, Maybe not genetic enhancement as such, but extreme forms of it. The ability, for example, to control for certain traits in our children. The ability to be able to do that. Sandel is not coming out vehemently against it in this article, but he is asking us to stop and pause, to slow down. Science and technology want to push full steam ahead often. The words are progress is the big word in science, and what philosophy and philosophers want scientists and science and society to do is to slow down and ask some tough philosophical questions about whether or not the pace of science and the pace of the technology is morally appropriate or not, whether it reaches certain limits and certain points at which we find it that we find that it's gone too far. And that's what Sandel's doing in this article. He simply wants to say, let's slow down and have a philosophical conversation about the appropriate uses of this kind of technology. Now, granted, Sandel wrote this way back in 2004, and so you may be reading some of it and you may be thinking, this is old news, that something like gene editing, which Sandel doesn't himself discuss in this article, has already surpassed and made more progress than Sandel could have, maybe predicted in this article that we're reading here. So this article is 16 years old. Usually in philosophy, an article being that old, that's pretty recent for a philosophy article. But given that we're dealing with rapidly changing technologies and developments in science, you may find some things here that you think Sandel, that this article is a bit outdated in terms of the things he's talking about. But that may be all the more reason that we need the Sandel piece, because it's still the questions he's asking may be even more important, given the fact that potentially in the last 15 years, 16 years since he wrote this, we've simply pushed full steam ahead with something like gene editing. Now, it's not to say the technology is ready for use in human beings, but progress is being made all the time. And so we might need Sandel's article even more now than maybe we did in 2004 when the technology wasn't as advanced. So that's kind of the background of kind of where he's coming from, why we're reading this. The title of the course on for this week is Morality and the Limits of Science. And that, what I've just discussed up leading up to this, I think captures why this week is titled Morality and the Limits of Science. So let me just say a bit about what Sandel's argument is. Sandel starts the article by referring to what uh, I have in the notes as the quote unquote liberal objections to genetic enhancement. And let me just say a bit about what that means. So, when Sandel states on page 1, in liberal societies, they reach first for the language of autonomy, fairness, and individual rights. And Sandel wants to say that objections to technology like genetic enhancement often take these forms. And so I want to refer to these as the liberal objections. That um, these are the first places we go to try and object to something like genetic enhancement. Now, for a fundamental reason, Sandel doesn't think these objections go far enough. In fact, they presuppose that genetic enhancement is something that we find desirable. They presuppose that genetic enhancement is a technology that we are okay with as a society. Because all of the objections assume that if we could make access to this technology fair, for example, if we could use market mechanisms such as supply and demand or government incentives, for example, if we could if we could use those mechanisms, market mechanisms that the free market very much goes along with something like a liberal society. If we could use those, then there would be nothing wrong with genetic enhancement on its own. And so again, the point is that um, the worry from the liberal perspective is that with assuming let's assume that there is this widespread, in some imagined future, that this technology becomes so widespread and so widely available that everyone can have access to it, that there wouldn't be this concern about creating two classes of people. Because, the objection would go to genetic enhancement is that genetic enhancement would be only something that rich people could afford. Wealthy individuals be the only ones who could afford the kind of technology that would allow them to select for certain genes in their children, for example. And so the worry would be that um, that It creates two classes of people, those who can afford it and those who don't. But but again, let's imagine that we can overcome that problem, that we can overcome the issue with the lack of equal access to this technology through some kind of market mechanism that allows us to make access to genetic enhancement technology available to everyone. And for the liberal objection, the person who's objecting from this perspective would say, well, yes, if equal access could be achieved to genetic enhancement technologies, then we would be okay with them. That's the assumption. It's not the technology as such, it's the problems that it might create in society insofar as it would interfere with fundamental liberal values such as equal access and equality of access and equality of opportunity. Um, and even more so, something like autonomy, the right for me to kind of decide for my own self, um, what makes me happy. And so again, the liberal objections would go if those objections could be satisfied, if we could ensure equal access to this technology, then we should go full steam ahead with the technology. And Sandel wants to say, wait a second, that's not actually what we find so morally problematic about these technologies. The it's not the inequality in society that will be created as a result of the technology. It's not that. It's what the technology itself represents in terms of the meaning of being a human being that we find problematic. That's Sandel's objection, right? So on page, so as according to the PDF as I have it numbered, on page 5, and I'm just kind of showing you down here in the corner where it says 5, as I have it printed out on the PDF, Sandel um, Sandel says, and this gets directly to his argument, at the right above where it says height, he says, the fundamental question is not how to ensure equal access to enhancement, but whether we should aspire to it in the first place. So that's a crucial, it's just crucial to understand where Sandel's coming from. Sandel's argument is not the inequality of access that will be created as a result of it, because that might happen. But Sandel's saying even if inequality of access is created and we solve it, that still doesn't get at the fundamental problem, which is, do we find this technology desirable? Should we, as a society, be aspiring, as he says, to use these technologies to the extent that we could? And so he goes on to talk about things like height and sex selection, and then one other example he had already given was in athletics. He's going to come back to the example about athletics several times. So he gives the example of muscles, he gives the example of memory, he gives the example of height, sex selection, and I'm not going to go through each of those in this lecture. You can read it on your own, but he's going through each of these and he's trying to show what the result would be if we could if we were able to control for all of these different attributes in, for example, in our children, whether that we could select, like we could um, uh, try and edit the genetic sequence of our future child to ensure that they have a gene that wouldn't make them short because they, I don't know, we want them to be a professional athlete, or we don't want them to be a professional athlete, but we want them to be athletic, and so we want to be able to make sure that they aren't going to be short in height, things like that. But in all these cases, he just wants to kind of show um, he just wants to show with each of these examples, um, for example, he wants to show with each of these examples how the liberal objections would kind of try to respond to these and how his objection responds to them. So on page 4, for example, when he says, it might be argued, so I'm on page 4 and I'm reading about he says, it might be argued The genetically enhanced athlete, like a drug enhanced athlete, would have an unfair advantage over his competitors. But the fairness argument against enhancement has a fatal flaw. It has always been the case that some athletes are better endowed genetically than others, and yet we do not consider this to undermine the fairness of competitive sports. From the standpoint of fairness, enhanced genetic differences would be no worse than natural ones. So then he says, if genetic enhancement is in sports is morally objectionable, it must be for reasons other than this. So not only can he respond to the equality of access one, but the fairness one is true too. There's already a natural unfairness that results simply from a genetic lottery, that some people are just better at things than others. So we can't say that it's unfair to use it's not only unfair because unfairness already exists simply by the virtue of, the science of genetics and the way that genes are passed from parents to offspring. So it can't be the fairness argument either. And that the fairness argument is another liberal objection, right? So in all these cases, he just wants to show why the liberal objections are unsatisfying. And again, I'm not going to go too far into his argument today, but what Sandel is ultimately going to argue, and this is where the next reading picks up. And I want, at the top of page 10 is where Sandel says, to acknowledge the giftedness of life is to recognize that our talents and powers are not wholly our own doing, despite the effort we expend to develop and to exercise them. It is also to recognize that not everything in the world is open to whatever we may desire or devise. So that's going to be the very beginnings of Sandel's argument. He's going to come back time and again to this argument about the giftedness of life. Now, that may have some religious connotations to it, but it doesn't have to. You don't need to say that these were gifts that were given to us by our Creator. You don't have to say that. You can if you want, but giftedness is simply an acknowledgement that there are certain things about ourselves that we don't control, that we don't choose. And part of what it means to be human is to have to reckon with the fact that not everything is in our control, and not everything can be changed at our will through the use of science and technology. So this is the philosophical moment when we have to kind of stop and ask whether we think it's a good idea for science and technology to be able to control. Let me say that again in a different way. Whether we think it's desirable to use science and technology in such a way that we can control everything about ourselves and everything about the universe. Philosophy and ethics wants to stop and ask, wait a second, is that a desirable and a good thing? Because it fundamentally interferes with the meaning of the creatures, the very creatures that we are. That's why this is such on a fundamentally deep level. If we are the kinds of creatures that don't have total control over our lives and our fates and what happens to us, um, then we might want to stop and ask that if there's a technology that would allow us to interfere on such a fundamental level, then we might want to stop and ask whether we think it's a good thing. And that's all Sandel is doing. That's what the point of this article is there is something troubling about technology that would allow us to change the meaning of what it means to be human, right? And to change the meaning of what it means to have to, overcome some of the things we don't like about it through our own effort. That if there's something we don't like about ourselves, for example, if we're born instead of, simply, using technology to make ourselves better, we might have to stop and ask, isn't it what it means to be human to have to overcome those kinds of things through our own efforts? And so, anyways, that's just the basis of his argument. I'm going to say more about the giftedness stuff in the next lecture, but I wanted to give you this beginning lecture and to say the general point is here's what Sandel thinks are the normal ways in which we object as a society to science and technology, specifically genetic enhancement. Here are the normal objections we make. We make objections on the basis of fairness and um, access, equality of access. And Sandel says those objections presuppose that if they could be solved, then we would be okay with the technology. And Sandel wants to say we haven't asked whether we're okay with the technology itself. That's what we need to have the conversation about. So that's all I have for this first lecture.